From the college by the lake, meeting the personalities and discussing the issues that affect all of Coeur d'Alene and the Inland Northwest. We are the North Idaho College Public Forum. And now here's your moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
We welcome you to the fifth program of our six-week series entitled The Issue of Censorship in America, Is the First Amendment Dead? On the fifth program, we're going to discuss the topic religion as perpetrator and victim of censorship. As you know, in the First Amendment, among all those things that are listed, religion is a major issue. We're very fortunate to have on the program today a very dear friend that I've known a long time, Bill Wasmuth, who is now the Executive Director of the Northwest Coalition Against Malicious Harassment that is located in Seattle, or that is where the headquarters, although it's a six-state human rights organization. Our guest is the former pastor of Our Lady of the Lake Catholic Parish in McCall, Idaho, and St. Pius X Catholic Parish in Coeur d'Alene. Our guest received his master's degree from Seattle University. In addition to his many years of church duties, Wasmuth became spokesperson for the Kootenai County Task Force on Human Relations, the group that courageously stood up to combat the racism, hate, and violence that emerged during the 1970s and 1980s in North Idaho. While serving as president of the task force, Wasmuth received death threats and injury threats, and narrowly escaped injury when his home was bombed by members of the neo-Nazi movement. Bill Wasmuth was named the Idaho Statesman Citizen of the Year in 1987 for his work in human rights and other fields. In addition, he received, along with others from the city of Coeur d'Alene and the Kootenai County Task Force, the Raoul Wallenberg Civic Award in New York City following the work in human rights. Wasmuth received the Coeur d'Alene Chamber of Commerce Distinguished Citizen of the Year Award in 1985, and he also was recognized for his work in establishing the first Idaho Cult Awareness Center as the recipient of the Leo J. Ryan Commemorative Award from the National Cult Awareness Network in 1987. Prior to becoming Executive Director of the Northwest Coalition, he was the first president. Bill, as always, it's a pleasure having you in town again, and thank you for participating in the symposium we've been having at North Idaho College.
Tony, thank you. It's great to be here.
I'm very pleased to have two panel members to question our guest today. First of all, Steve Schenck, who's Dean of College Relations and Development at North Idaho College, and Lloyd Marsh, who chairs the Division of Physical Sciences at North Idaho College. And I shall ask Steve to commence the questioning.
Thank you, Tony. Bill, I was struck by the title of our program today. It seems a little unusual that religion would be both perpetrators and victims of censorship in this country. And I wonder if you could take a minute to set that in some sort of historic perspective for us and tell us a little bit about how those seemingly dichotomous events have taken place.
I think that anybody who looks at history even quickly can see how the freedom to practice religion has been impaired by things throughout history. If we go from the Holocaust to World War II, certainly the Jewish people's freedom of religion was denied there, to the Inquisition, Middle Ages times, to the wars around the globe, to Ireland now, and in the United States even in our 200 years as a country. I think the same thing has been true. Some of that by government edict even, the denial to the Native Americans of freedom to practice their Native American religion and the systematic attempt to eradicate that as well as to eradicate the Native American culture. Certainly a removal of their freedom of practice of religion. On the other hand, I think it's also true that most often the perpetrators of these kinds of denials of freedom to practice religion are other religions. That one group of people believe that God is giving them the right answer, and therefore they somehow believe that God is also telling them to impose this truth on everyone else. So a person's freedom to believe sometimes, as he or she wants to, sometimes gets transferred around to you will also believe as I believe, and therefore I've removed your freedom by doing that kind of thing. So I think historically it's always been there. I think historically it's been in the United States too, both that religion has been the victim of censorship in the sense of denying freedom of practice of religion, and also that sometimes that's perpetrated by religions themselves, both in terms of denying the freedom of religion as well as religions denying other freedoms to people as well.
Are we moving in the right direction, Bill, do you think, in terms of religious freedom? Is the civilization in general making progress, and are religions themselves beginning to recognize the wisdom of allowing the right to worship to one another?
to do a general sweep of history and say yea or nay to that, I don't know. I think I would tend to think of it more in terms of cyclic kind of thing. I think we go through a period of time when perhaps there is greater freedom and greater understanding, both in terms of this issue of the freedoms of people as well as others. And then there are swings in that cycle when we go through a time when those freedoms are pulled back. I think that sometimes is attached in both religion and in other areas of political life, for example, with a cycle that swings toward a fundamentalism or toward an extremism. Maybe we would be better. As we get to the extreme of either the right or the left, for example, both extremes are absolutist often. And the farther you get to those extremes, the closer you get to those extremes, the less tolerance there is for diversity of opinion, the less tolerance there is to allow freedom of expression or freedom of worship or freedom of political party, whatever. It seems to me in the more recent past, the last 10 to 20 years, we've been headed as a world perhaps, but I think also in the United States, into a more fundamentalistic kind of direction. And as we move closer to that extreme, it seems to me that religious freedom and other freedoms become more threatened and more impaired. One of the fallouts, for example, unfortunate fallouts from the Persian Gulf War is that fundamental Islamic faith has a chance of becoming more dominating in that area of the world. That does not augur well for human rights in the Middle East. The chances of the Islamic fundamentalists controlling more in that area will impair human rights, just as fundamentalist control in other parts of the world seems to impair for civil rights and human rights and religious freedom as well.
Lloyd Mark.
Thank you. Bill, as an instructor, I'm often concerned about definitions and ambiguity, and I wonder if you could spend just a few minutes perhaps defining religion for me and for our audience, and also, is there a difference between church and religion? Is there an ambiguity there?
I might be creating my own definitions, but since you asked, I have the freedom to do that. I would see religion as a philosophy of life that has God in the picture or has a supreme being in the picture. And so a religion could be unique to a particular individual person. I would see church as a sociological accumulation of folks with a particular religion. So in that sense, every church would have a religion. Not all religions would have a church. Every person who belongs to a church would belong to a religion or have a religion. Not all people who have a religion would have a church. You can expand that a little bit. When you're looking at religious freedom in the United States, I think we probably need to even extend a bit beyond that and say religious freedom in the sense of a philosophy of life and the values connected with that, whether or not there is an identifiable supreme being there. Because when you talk about the freedom to express a religion, what's also guaranteed there is the freedom of a person to not believe in a God or a supreme being. And so I would want to include, when I say the freedom of religion guaranteed by the First Amendment, I would also want to include the freedom of those folks, or we folks, whoever, who do not believe in a supreme being, do not believe in a power beyond what they have right here, and they have the freedom to practice that philosophy of life as well. And that would come in an amendment under religion, I think. And it doesn't say the freedom to practice religion and all other philosophies of life that do not include a supreme being. I think it means that. So in the broadest sense, in this context, I would say religion is a philosophy of life and the values connected with that, whether or not there is a supreme being involved in it or not. Churches are an organized sociological gathering of people who pursue a particular vision of religion.
Just a little follow-up on that. If we have the right to practice a religion which may believe in a supreme being and one that not, do these often come in conflict? And when they do, what do we do about this?
Oh yeah, I think it comes in conflict all the time. And I think it comes in conflict very much in terms of our society in the United States. Perhaps more so here than in some others, but I'm not an expert in world history and world religions. And so I'm sure it's true in other parts of the world too. But I think what's unique maybe to the United States is our sense of pluralism. There is no established religion that goes back centuries in the United States. If there was any, it was the Native American religion, and that was systematically eliminated or at least oppressed to a point of where it was insignificant. There's nothing that assimilated everything else. There is no national background religion to accommodate a national people because we're an accumulation of all kinds of peoples and all kinds of religions. So we're a unique pluralism, and we have a pluralistic society, I think, sometimes in terms of religion. I think sometimes that's overlooked. The majority of believers of a particular religion in the United States are Christian. 147 million, something like that. 100 million people in the United States do not adhere to a particular religious belief. 5 to 6 million Jewish people, 5 million or 2.5 million Islamic. Islamic is, by the way, the fastest growing religion in the United States right now. That number is increasing very dramatically, very rapidly. So when you accumulate all of that, we have a pluralistic religious society. But I think often we sort of think of ourselves and we sort of set a tone as a society that we're Christian. The more we promote that, and the more imposing we become in terms of imposing that on our whole society, the more restrictive we are of the freedom of religion of others, both those who do not belong to an identifiable religion, who would have a philosophy of life that does not include a religious belief, as well as on people of other religious beliefs. So yes, it does clash. I think like being pluralistic in terms of cultures and races and ethnic backgrounds, being pluralistic in terms of religions is always going to be a challenge. It's always going to be difficult to say, I disagree with you, you are different from me, and yet you have just as much rights and the same rights in this society as I do. That's always going to be a challenge, I suspect.
I would like to make a comment before I ask my question. I think Bill has done this absolutely excellent job in his definition of explaining the First Amendment. When, Bill, you indicate that people have a right to express their religious beliefs, to worship and so forth, the Free Exercise Clause permits that. But when you also indicate people have a right not to have religion, the No Establishment Clause would take that. So that's the magic, it seems to me, of the First Amendment, taking those two clauses together, allowing that religious exercise, or also abstaining if you choose. Mm-hmm. I, like Steve, have simply been fascinated with the topic that you were assigned, and you chose your own title to it, Religion as Perpetrator and Victim of Censorship at this symposium. And if you don't mind, I'd like for you to take a minute with our viewers to give us an example or two where you see in history that religion has been a perpetrator of censoring, a specific example, and an example or two where a religious organization has been the victim.
Okay, maybe to start with the victims. It's the way my mind is working currently, according to the title, so we'll have to do that. You got to play with my mind these days. The Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith just released its statistics for 1990 in terms of anti-Semitic incidents of harassment, and their numbers are something like 1,350 incidents of harassment in the United States against people because of their Jewish faith. That number of incidents and that level of anti-Semitic activity certainly is a threat to the freedom of the Jewish people to practice their faith without intimidation, without fear in our country. I think that's pretty obvious. I think the continuing attack on intended or unintended on the Native American religion is around. I mean, we all know historically about the efforts to assimilate the Native Americans into a European Christian culture and send people to Christian schools and to dress them in European clothes and to take away their costumes and all of that, and to deny them the religious freedom of practicing the religious beliefs that they had for centuries. But that continues in some subtle ways. Religious beliefs of the Native American are often made sideshow kinds of items, to the point now of where many Native Americans are saying, you know, we don't want to have others watching at all or viewing what we do because they steal them, they cheapen them, they trivialize them, they make them into sideshow kinds of things. I think that's part of it. I think those are dramatic kinds of cases of where we have, as a society or elements of society, have inhibited the free practice of religion, and the religions are the victims of bigotry. And that's how I'm going to use censorship here, is in terms of the bigotry. Where they're the perpetrators of it. As I mentioned earlier, religions often are and people of religion are often the ones who want to inhibit the practice of religion on the part of other people. Some of that is very obvious, some of that is very clear. Historically, the Catholic Church's involvement in the Inquisition and in the witch hunts, hundreds of thousands of people were killed in those episodes, and it was an imposition of one religious belief on another. You know, there's certain political kinds of things entered into that as well, but it was an imposition of one religious belief on another. The silence of many Christian faiths during the Holocaust time, that was not more was not opposed more directly. The refusal on the part of some religions still to accept the existence of other religions. That's all very obvious kinds of cases, I think, of discrimination and of the oppression and censorship of another, freedom of religion of another. But there are more subtle ones, too. When in our society we say, for example, that was a Christian thing to do, we often confuse the word Christian and good. What we mean when we say that is that was a good thing to do. But we put that identification of good and Christian together when we say that was a Christian thing to do. What comes to mind when we say that's an Islamic thing to do? Not that it's a good thing. Most what would come to mind would be it's a terroristic thing to do, probably. Or when we say that's a Jewish thing to do. Not again that it was a good thing to do. It would be more that it was a shrewd thing to do, perhaps. Okay, we've, as a society, identified some particular words and made that kind of connection. That to me is a form of censorship. That's a form of bigotry. That's a form of inhibiting the freedom of religion of some because we've made those kinds of word connections. It's subtle, but it's there. What happens when we start to identify too closely the goals of a particular religion and the goals of our government? Sometimes those get interlocked in terms of our foreign policy, for example. When we're foreign policy aimed towards South America and Central America during the last 2 decades, the fundamentalist directed religions were used there by our foreign policy makers in the United States because they had the same goals. They could be intercrossed. The foreign policy wanted to stop some movements that they had identified as terrorist. The fundamentalists were tied in with the blackballing of some of the groups that were identified in the same kind of way. Foreign policy and church groups used some of the same goals, or pursued some of the same goals, and so they were used at the same time. Or some church groups who want to have church leadership and government leadership be the same. Christian patriots do that, for example. Their idea is a Christian commonwealth where you could not distinguish between church leadership and government leadership. The Mormon Church has some of that too, and the more fundamentalist, absolutist Mormon people would believe in that same kind of commonwealth ruled by religion. And as a matter of fact, as we all know, in some communities in southeastern Idaho that exists, where the freedom to practice a religion other than the LDS religion would be severely impaired. On the other hand, other religions are restrictive of LDS behavior. Tony, you know well the study that we participated in 1988 through Boise State University, that the tone and the feeling of non-Mormon people in Idaho toward Mormons was quite low, that the level of tolerance there was very low compared to some other factors that were put in place. The No-Mo Club at Centennial High School in Boise area now, where the high school students are openly organized, this little club to be anti-Mormon. They didn't pick that up from their textbooks. They got that from the society in which they live. So I think Mormons in our society are a good example right now of both being perpetrator of denial of freedom of religion to some, as well as being victimized by it. Long answer.
That's a great answer. But we've got to go to Steve. I just want to make a comment that one of the things that comes out in your comments is that it's been very difficult and challenging for one religion to be tolerant of another religion.
Very much so. Very much so.
Steve?
Bill, is there a necessary correlation, you think, between strong religious belief and a tendency toward intolerance?
I think so. Well, I shouldn't say strong, because I think somebody can be strongly believing in a religion that would say that everybody has a right to believe what they want. But I think that sometimes becoming fanatical almost about a religious belief, a person becomes so convinced that what they have is true, and what they have is what's right in relation to God and life and what life is all about, that they want to make sure and share that with another person. You know, I have it, I know it's right, so I want you to have it too. It's that kind of graciousness almost, that kind of generosity. Well, what if you don't want it? Well, if I really believe that it's right, then maybe I start imposing it somehow. That this really is good for you, and you need to know that it's good for you. And so I'm going to force you to see how good it is for you. You know, it's the old parent telling the kid, this spinach is good for you, you will eat it. And I'm bigger than you are, so you will have it. I think there is some of that, where a person really genuinely believes it's the truth, genuinely believes it's the best way to live life, and so wants to impose it. That does not mesh, though, with our Constitution. That does not mesh with our American system of freedom of belief. It does not mesh with pluralism. I can be very convinced of my religion and what I believe, and be very convinced that it's true, and can be very convinced it's the best way. But in our system, with a pluralistic system, I have to also say, you have the freedom to not accept that if you don't want to. And I can't impose that upon you.
We mentioned a couple of times in our discussion, you have, that there's a growing fundamentalist trend in this country. And I believe you mentioned that isn't necessarily a good thing for religious tolerance.
That's right.
This is similar to my last question, but is there a relationship between fundamentalism and intolerance?
I think so. I think there's a relationship also between extreme on the other end, and I want to keep that balanced. I think the extremes on the liberal and conservative, or the right or the left, in either case, I think the closer you get to the extremes, the less tolerant you become, because the more absolutist you become, or a person becomes, not you, but a person becomes. And so, but I think in our current history right now, our current period of history, we need to be more concerned about the drift to the right and the drift toward fundamentalism, because that's the way I think we're going. If 20 years from now we're all perched right on the edge of absolute extremism on the left, I would be saying the same things about that on the left if I'm still dealing with this issue. But I think right now the point is that we're drifting toward the right. Remember the days when John Birch Society used to be, that they used to own the far right. Now people are leaving the John Birch Society because they're too moderate. The far right has moved a good bit farther to the far right. In the process of doing that, mainstream has moved to the right, I think. And I think that's true in religious beliefs as well as true in our general political kinds of beliefs. I think as we see some far right radical religious beliefs like Christian identity theology that Richard Butler and the Aryan Nations and 230 other different places in the United States preach, we see how radical right that is. When we see other forms of radical right preaching, then it sort of makes something that before was seen as pretty right more acceptable, more mainstream. And so with that kind of perspective, we start looking at people or hearing people like Jerry Falwell or Pat Robertson or some who maybe in another age would have seemed pretty far right. Now they start sounding a little bit more mainstream. And since they aren't as radical as those other folks, we maybe listen to them a little bit more. And we maybe miss the fact that when they start talking about the re-Christianization of America, and when they start using words like America is the new promised land, what they're really preaching, if you take that at face value, and we would have to assume that they would want us to, what they're preaching is bigotry. Because when you re-Christianize America, you exclude all those folks who are not Christian, or at least make them second-rate kinds of citizens. Or at least say, you're not as good as the rest of us. You don't belong here quite as much as the rest of us do. When you make America the promised land, God's promised land, somehow God has special favor for the United States. That's one step, a very small step, from that belief to starting to say it's a little bit easier for us to bomb the Islamic people. And it's a little bit easier for us to attack somebody of Hindu faith or somebody of Buddhist faith than it is to attack somebody who's Christian faith, or to attack somebody who doesn't have the same kind of political system or economic system as we do, to start saying that we have a God-given responsibility to impose our American system on the rest of the world. God wants us to do this. It's a very small step once you grant that first premise that says that this is God-given land. So I guess my point is that we start hearing some of this from the Falwells and the Robertsons, and we say, gosh, that's sort of mainstream now. It was right a few years ago. But since that drift has been pulling us that way. So I think it's not only the people who are way on the extreme that need to be of concern on this issue. I think we need to also be critical and evaluative of those who are maybe appearing to be a little bit more mainstream right now, but are actually leading us into some of those same kinds of directions.
Lloyd Marsh.
Yeah. Well, sort of trying to put a balance in that, you talked about the conservative fundamentalists, and then we have to come back to the liberals on the other side. Our founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson, advocated support of religion, but no particular religion. And it seems to me that in some of our public institutions like schools, public schools and so forth, that we seem to be going to no religion. In other words, we've taken prayer out of school, we've taken prayer out of graduation, we've taken prayer out of football games, being able to say prayer before that. Is this the liberal, the other side, the counterculture to the fundamentalists?
I don't know if you can say that that's the liberal side. I think that might be as an expanding of a real belief that we started with earlier, that a freedom of religion includes the freedom to not have an identifiable supreme being or an identifiable philosophy of life religion that includes a supreme being. How can you do a prayer in a public establishment that is going to be reflective of everybody that's there when you have a pluralistic gathering in front of you? Now, certainly when we start saying a particular prayer that involves a particular religious belief, then we'd say, you got to be more ecumenical, you got to expand that. So, and I did this for a while, you know, I did public prayers. And I would try to do public prayers that would be, that a Jewish person could respond to, that an Islamic person could respond to, anybody who agreed to a supreme being, that some of the people who were in AA groups with me could respond to, you know, that there's power greater than I. I'd try to put my prayers in that kind of context. But I'm not sure that that's even good enough, because there's a large group of people out there for whom calling upon any kind of power beyond me or supreme being doesn't make sense. So why should we have a prayer in front of a sporting event or in front of a... no, I don't know. I think it's the challenge of that question. I'm not sure that's a liberal or conservative question. I think that's more of a really trying to understand the basic... how far does this extend and what do we really mean? You know, your definitions at the beginning. We need to define religion. That was right on target. I think that definition is part of where this question goes.
Thank you.
That we should be a society without religion, no. That we're a society in any way that imposes religious beliefs upon each other, I think that's where we start running into difficulty with our pluralism.
This symposium took place in March, but these broadcasts are taking place later because they were pre-recorded. But what we learned in March, I think, among other things, or confirmed the fact that they were there, is that very few countries have a First Amendment as we do, and have even the strength within that amendment that we do. And Bill, I'd like to get you to respond. We don't have much time left, but do you think the First Amendment has been very significant in at least keeping some control on the intolerance and the persecution?
Oh yes, oh yes. It's like the freedom of press and the freedom of the other freedoms that we have in our society. You know, it's a constant fight within our society, and it's a constant tension. But look at what's the benefits that have happened to our society because of it. And I guess that's part of why I get excited when I deal with this issue. There is no perfect, crystal clear answer to the question that you just asked a little bit ago. But it's a challenge, it's a tension, it's something we're always going to be working on. But it's the fact that we keep working with it that makes our society great, that makes our democracy work, that makes it something that we live up to each day rather than that we lived on something that somebody else did 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago. And so, yes, I think we are in a better position today in terms of, because the First Amendment was around. And I would not like to live in a society where we didn't have a First Amendment.
I must close, and I thank you, Bill, so much. It's been just absolutely excellent program and stimulating. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we will close this series next week at this time when we'll do the 6th program, in which we'll do an overview of all the first 5 programs and talk about the First Amendment in that very broad perspective. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
North Idaho College Public Forum is videotaped live by Telemedia Services on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to catch the North Idaho College Public Forum the same time next week on this television station.